"Enjoy the streets, Mom." The words hung in the air like shards of glass, sharp and cutting. Andrew stood tall in the doorway of his sprawling Boston mansion, his tailored suit as crisp as his expression was cold. Across from him, Aurelia, clutching a tattered suitcase, stared in disbelief. Her tear-streaked face seemed older, weathered by years of sacrifice and struggle. "Andrew, you don't mean this," she pleaded, her voice trembling under the weight of her son's cruel decision. "I've made up my mind," he replied, his tone as distant as the gleaming chandeliers behind him. "I can't carry you anymore. You've become a burden." Aurelia recoiled, as if the words had physically struck her. "A burden?" she echoed, the pain in her voice thick enough to break a heart of stone. "Everything I did, every sacrifice I made, it was all for you, Andrew." He folded his arms across his chest, his gaze unyielding. "And I've paid you back 100 times over. You have a roof over your head. You've had more than enough, but I've reached my limit. You need to figure out how to live on your own now." Her knees nearly buckled as she reached out, desperation spilling from her like a dam breaking. "Andrew, please, don't do this. I'm your mother." But Andrew stepped back, keeping a deliberate distance between them. Behind him, 2 uniformed security guards stood silently, their expressions neutral as they awaited his command. "This isn't up for discussion," he said, his voice void of emotion. "Take her out." The guards moved forward, but Aurelia raised her hand, stopping them. Her pride, though battered, remained intact. She turned back to Andrew one last time, her lips trembling as she spoke. "One day, Andrew, one day, you'll understand what you've done here." Her words hung in the air, met with nothing but his steely silence. Slowly, she turned and walked down the mansion's grand steps, her steps heavy, her heart shattered. Standing at the gate, Aurelia paused, gripping the suitcase handle tightly. She looked up at the gray Boston sky, a sharp wind cutting through her thin coat. In her bag was a faded photograph of Andrew as a young boy, smiling wide as he held her hand at a neighborhood park. That memory now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Andrew remained by the door, watching her retreating figure through the frosted glass until she disappeared into the bustling city streets. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to turn away, to not look back. As Aurelia trudged through the unfamiliar streets of Boston, the lights of luxury storefronts mocked her with their brilliance. Every step felt like a battle against the icy wind and her own grief. She had raised a son to be strong, successful, and determined, but had she also raised him to be heartless? She whispered to herself as she tightened her coat against the cold. What happened to my boy? For Andrew, this was just another decision, another way to protect his carefully curated life. But beneath his confident exterior, something stirred. He couldn't quite name it, but the weight of his mother's last words lingered in his chest like an anchor. What could lead a son to abandon the very woman who gave him life? Was Andrew truly incapable of love, or was there something else, some deeper wound, that explained his actions? The cold Boston wind carried their stories in opposite directions, but the threads of their lives were far from severed. For every step Aurelia took into the unknown, a reckoning was waiting to unfold. Aurelia wasn't always as fragile, and Andrew wasn't always as distant. Their story began in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Boston, where love and struggle intertwined daily. As a single mother, Aurelia juggled multiple jobs to ensure her son had food on the table and a chance at a better life. She'd wake up before dawn, her hands already calloused from years of cleaning houses for the wealthy. While Andrew slept, she would prepare his lunch and carefully tuck a note inside. "Dream big, my son. I love you." Every word was a promise that she would carry the weight of their world, no matter how heavy it got. Andrew was her pride and joy, a boy with a quick smile and a mind full of ideas. Even as a child, He was ambitious, always talking about building a life far beyond their cramped apartment. Aurelia encouraged him, reminding him daily that he could achieve anything. But deep down, she feared he might one day resent the hardships of their life. The turning point came when Andrew turned 14. A routine visit to the grocery store ended in humiliation when a neighbor whispered loud enough for Aurelia to hear. "She can barely keep the lights on. That boy's going nowhere." That night, Andrew found her crying at the kitchen table, her shoulders shaking as she tried to muffle her sobs. It was a moment that seared itself into his memory. He made a vow to himself. He would never let her feel that kind of shame again. Fueled by that promise, Andrew excelled in school, earning scholarships and eventually making his way to an Ivy League university. Aurelia worked overtime to cover what the scholarships didn't, sacrificing her health and happiness for his future. She couldn't have been prouder when he graduated at the top of his class, though she barely recognized the polished young man who accepted his diploma with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. Success followed quickly. Andrew climbed the corporate ladder at lightning speed, his ambition unmatched. He went from the son of a cleaning lady to the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company in less than a decade. But with each step he took toward wealth and power, he seemed to take a step away from Aurelia. It started subtly, missed phone calls, rushed holidays. Then came the excuses for why she couldn't visit his new home or why he couldn't make time for her birthday. Aurelia didn't complain. She told herself he was busy building the life she had always dreamed for him. But cracks began to form in their relationship. During a rare visit to Andrew's sleek penthouse, Aurelia noticed a framed photo of him with his colleagues, but none of her. She asked him about it, and his answer stung. "Mom, my life is different now. People don't need to know everything about where I come from." It was like a dagger to her heart. Still, she swallowed her pain and reminded herself that Andrew was under immense pressure. After all, she'd raised him to aim high, and this was the price of success, or so she thought. Yet, there were moments she couldn't ignore. His dismissive tone when she called, the way he avoided her questions about his personal life, and his growing impatience whenever she talked about the past. Aurelia began to feel like a stranger to her own son, as if the bond they'd once shared was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't pinpoint when the transformation had begun, but one thing was clear. Andrew was no longer the boy who used to run home from school to tell her about his day. Instead, he was a man consumed by ambition, his heart hardened by the relentless pursuit of success. And as Aurelia sat alone in her small apartment, she couldn't help but wonder if she had failed him, not by giving him too little, but by sacrificing too much. In his quest to rise above his humble beginnings, had Andrew forgotten the woman who gave him everything? Or was there something more, something buried in their past, that had driven this wedge between them? The answers were coming, but Aurelia didn't know if her heart could bear the truth. For Andrew, every achievement felt like a battle won in a lifelong war against the shadow of his humble beginnings. By the time he turned 30, he had not only escaped the cramped apartment of his childhood, but also built an empire that stretched across Boston and beyond. His name was on the front pages of business magazines, his phone filled with invitations to elite events. He was no longer Aurelia's boy. He was Andrew Bennett, a self-made millionaire. It all started with a single idea. In his dorm room at Harvard, Andrew developed a financial technology app that simplified investment strategies for middle-class families. The concept was revolutionary, and it quickly attracted investors. What began as a side project to earn extra cash exploded into a business worth millions. Andrew's focus and work ethic were relentless. While his peers were out celebrating internships or new jobs, he spent nights refining his pitch decks and strategizing his next move. Every rejection fueled his determination. Every small victory became a stepping stone. But with every success came new pressures. Investors demanded results. Competitors sought to outpace him, and the media was eager to pounce on any misstep. Andrew learned quickly that vulnerability had no place in his world. He built walls, shutting out anything that might distract him, including his past. Aurelia was proud of her son's accomplishments, but she couldn't ignore the distance growing between them. Their phone calls became less frequent, their conversations shorter. Whenever she asked about his work, Andrew would reply with rehearsed brevity, as if the details of his life were too complex or too unimportant to share. "Mom, I'm busy. You wouldn't understand how cutthroat this industry is," he'd say, brushing off her questions with a tone that left no room for further discussion. Andrew justified the distance as a necessary sacrifice. He told himself he was protecting his mother from the harsh realities of his world. He didn't want her to worry about the late-night meetings, the ruthless boardroom battles, or the stress that came with running a multi-million-dollar company. But deep down, there was another reason he kept her at arm's length: shame. As much as Andrew loved his mother, he couldn't shake the embarrassment he felt about their past. The memories of unpaid bills, second-hand clothes, and whispered judgments from neighbors haunted him. Aurelia, however, saw through his carefully curated exterior. During a rare dinner at his penthouse, she noticed the tightness in his smile and the way he avoided eye contact whenever the conversation turned personal. "Andrew, you've achieved so much. But are you happy?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. He stiffened, his fork pausing midair. "Mom, happiness doesn't pay the bills. I'm building a legacy." Aurelia sighed, recognizing the walls he'd built around himself. She wanted to tell him that legacy meant nothing without love, that the boy who once dreamed of greatness had already achieved it the moment he decided to rise above their circumstances. But she stayed silent, afraid of pushing him further away. Andrew's world continued to expand, new clients, bigger deals, endless accolades. Yet, with every new milestone, a sense of emptiness began to creep in. Success, he realized, came with its own set of chains. He was admired but not truly loved, respected but often feared. The few moments he allowed himself to think of Aurelia were accompanied by an uncomfortable guilt. He sent her checks to ease his conscience, rationalizing that money was the best way to show he cared. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. One day, while scrolling through his calendar filled with back-to-back meetings, Andrew paused on a reminder: Mom's birthday. For a fleeting moment, he thought of calling her, of hearing the warmth in her voice, and maybe even making plans to see her. But then his phone buzzed with an urgent email, and the thought was gone as quickly as it had come. As Andrew climbed higher in the world, the distance between him and Aurelia widened. He convinced himself it was the price of ambition, but he couldn't ignore the growing weight in his chest, the feeling that no amount of success could fill the void he had created. And so, Andrew carried on, unaware that his carefully constructed life was about to face a reckoning that no amount of money or power could prevent. When the heavy gates of Andrew's mansion closed behind her, Aurelia stood motionless for a moment, her breath visible in the chilly Boston air. Her son's words, "Enjoy the streets, Mom," echoed in her mind like a cruel refrain. She clutched her worn suitcase tighter, fighting back tears. For years, she had carried the weight of their lives, and now she was being cast aside like a burden. But Aurelia was no stranger to hardship. The same resilience that had fueled her as a young single mother now stirred within her once more. She had survived storms before, and she would survive this one too. Her first night on the streets was a harsh reality check. Boston's icy winds cut through her thin coat, and every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. She found temporary shelter in a crowded church basement, where volunteers handed out blankets and bowls of lukewarm soup. Sitting among strangers with stories as heavy as her own, Aurelia felt a flicker of gratitude. Despite everything, she was still standing, The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty. Aurelia navigated the city's labyrinth of shelters and food banks, determined to find her footing. Each night, she would lie awake on a cot or park bench, clutching the photo of young Andrew that she always carried in her purse. It was her anchor, a reminder of the love and sacrifices that had defined her life. Aurelia's pride wouldn't allow her to wallow in self-pity. She began volunteering at the same shelters that took her in, washing dishes, sweeping floors, and offering a kind word to others who had lost their way. Her warmth and strength didn't go unnoticed, and soon she became a beacon of hope to those around her. One evening, while serving meals at a soup kitchen, Aurelia met Margaret, an older woman with a sharp wit and a fierce determination to help others. Margaret had been through her own share of struggles, and she recognized a kindred spirit in Aurelia. "You've got a spark in you, sweetheart," Margaret said, handing Aurelia a cup of coffee. "Don't let this world put it out." Margaret introduced Aurelia to a network of people who helped her secure temporary housing and a part-time job at a local bakery. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Aurelia threw herself into her work, finding solace in the rhythmic kneading of dough and the simple joy of seeing customers smile. As the weeks turned into months, Aurelia began to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She refused to let anger or bitterness consume her. Instead, she focused on the small victories: a steady income, a warm place to sleep, and the friendships she had formed along the way. Yet, even as she moved forward, the pain of Andrew's betrayal lingered. She replayed their last conversation in her mind, searching for answers. Had she pushed him too hard? Had her sacrifices blinded her to his struggles? Or was this simply who he had become? A man so consumed by ambition that he had forgotten the value of love? Aurelia resolved to write him a letter, pouring out everything she had kept bottled up inside. She spent hours crafting her words, but when it came time to send it, she hesitated. What if he didn't read it? What if he didn't care? Instead, she tucked the letter away, deciding to hold on to it until the right moment. She didn't know if Andrew would ever come to his senses, but she refused to give up on him entirely. After all, he was still her son, and she still believed in the boy who once held her hand and promised to make her proud. Aurelia's journey was far from over. Each day was a test of her strength and resolve, but she faced it with the quiet determination that had defined her life. Somewhere deep in her heart, she carried the hope that Andrew would one day find his way back to her and to himself. Little did she know, that day was closer than she could imagine, and the path to it would be paved with revelations that neither she nor Andrew could have foreseen. Andrew's life appeared flawless from the outside. The media lauded him as a genius entrepreneur. His company's stocks were soaring, and his name was often mentioned alongside Boston's most influential figures. Yet, behind the polished exterior, Andrew's carefully curated world was starting to crumble. Late one evening, after a particularly grueling board meeting, Andrew found himself alone in his sprawling penthouse. The silence was deafening, amplifying the gnawing discomfort he had been suppressing for months. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into the leather armchair by the window, staring out at the city skyline. It should have felt like triumph, sitting at the top of the world. Instead, all he could think about was the look on his mother's face the last time he saw her. Her tearful eyes, her trembling voice. It haunted him in moments like these when there was no one around to distract him. For the first time in years, Andrew allowed himself to remember their life before the wealth and success. He saw flashes of his mother's hands scrubbing floors until they bled, her exhausted smile as she made his favorite meal with whatever she could afford, and the way she would hug him tight after every achievement, no matter how small. But those memories were quickly overshadowed by others, moments he had buried deep. He recalled the shame he felt as a teenager when other kids teased him for wearing secondhand clothes, the burning embarrassment when his mother showed up at his school to deliver a forgotten lunch, and the whispered insults he overheard about their poverty. Andrew had spent his entire life running from those feelings, determined to prove everyone wrong. Yet, in his relentless pursuit of success, had he become the very thing he despised? Had he traded his humanity for a seat at the table of the elite? The questions were unbearable, so he drowned them in work. Andrew buried himself in meetings, presentations, and deals, convincing himself that his achievements justified his actions. But no matter how much he accomplished, the guilt lingered like a shadow. One day, during a rare moment of reflection, Andrew came across a news article about a local woman who had turned her life around after facing homelessness. Her story was inspiring, but what struck Andrew most was the photo of her smiling at a community center event. Her joy was genuine, untainted by the weight of ambition or wealth. Andrew stared at the image for a long time, a knot tightening in his chest. He wondered if his mother had found a similar sense of peace, or if she was still struggling because of his decision. He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him like a second skin. The final straw came during a gala event hosted by one of Boston's elite families. Amid the laughter and clinking glasses, an older woman approached Andrew, her kind eyes twinkling as she introduced herself. She reminded him of Aurelia in a way that made his chest ache. "My son is about your age," she said warmly. "He always tells me that no matter how successful he gets, he owes it all to his mom. Isn't that the truth for all of us?" Andrew forced a polite smile, but her words cut through him like a knife. He excused himself, retreating to the balcony to catch his breath. The night air was cold, but it couldn't numb the growing storm inside him. Andrew realized he had spent years justifying his actions, convincing himself that he had done what was necessary. But now, the cracks in his facade were impossible to ignore. The guilt was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. For the first time, Andrew allowed himself to wonder, was it too late to make things right? Little did he know, the opportunity for redemption was closer than he thought, and it would come in a way that would shake the very foundation of his carefully constructed life. Life has a way of orchestrating encounters that shake us to our core. For Andrew, that moment came on a cold February evening as he exited a high-end restaurant in downtown Boston. He had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal and was about to step into his chauffeured car when a commotion across the street caught his attention. A group of people had gathered outside a modest community center. The warm glow of its light spilled onto the sidewalk, illuminating a scene of shared laughter and camaraderie. Curious, Andrew's gaze lingered on the crowd. His eyes widened as they locked onto a familiar figure. It was Aurelia. She was standing near the entrance, her hands busy serving cups of hot coffee to a line of grateful people. Her face, though lined with age and hardship, radiated a kind of contentment Andrew hadn't seen in years. She was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile. For a moment, Andrew felt rooted to the spot, his carefully constructed world tilting beneath him. He hadn't seen his mother since the day he told her to leave, and the sight of her now, so far removed from the life he had built, hit him like a freight train. The memory of his harsh words echoed in his mind. "Enjoy the streets, Mom." The shame was almost unbearable. "Sir, are you ready to leave?" his driver asked, pulling Andrew out of his trance. "No," Andrew said abruptly, shaking his head. "Wait here." He crossed the street, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. As he approached, he noticed the way people greeted Aurelia with warmth and respect. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving in her own way, making a difference in the lives of those around her. Andrew hesitated at the edge of the crowd, unsure of how to approach. But before he could decide, Aurelia turned, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them moved. The bustling sounds of the city seemed to fade into silence. "Andrew," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of surprise and guarded emotion. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like a boy again, standing before the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of their estrangement hung heavy between them as they stood there, surrounded by strangers yet utterly alone in that moment. Andrew struggled to find the right words, but Aurelia spoke first. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone neither cold nor warm, but measured, as if bracing herself for whatever might come next. Andrew glanced at the coffee pot in her hand, at the people milling around, and then back at her. I didn't know you were involved in this kind of work," he said, fumbling for something to say. Aurelia gave a small, knowing smile. "There's a lot you don't know about me anymore, Andrew." Her words stung, but they weren't spoken out of anger. Instead, they carried a quiet strength that reminded him of the mother he had always admired. "I made a mistake," Andrew admitted, his voice trembling. "I've made a lot of mistakes." Aurelia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Mistakes are part of life," she said finally. "What matters is what you do to fix them." Andrew felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent years running from his guilt, burying it under layers of success and ambition. But now, standing before the woman who had given him everything, he realized there was no running anymore. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice raw with vulnerability. Aurelia hesitated, her eyes searching his for sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, "but not here. Let's go somewhere quieter." As they walked away from the crowd, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was a turning point, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. What he didn't know was that their conversation would reveal truths he was unprepared to face, truths that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his mother, his success, and himself. Andrew and Aurelia found themselves at a small cafe on the edge of the city, far from the imposing skyscrapers and bustling streets that marked his usual haunts. The cozy atmosphere contrasted sharply with the tension that hung between them. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching longer than either was comfortable with. Aurelia broke it first. "So, what is it you want to say, Andrew?" she asked, her tone steady but cautious. Andrew looked down at the coffee cup in his hands, his fingers tracing the rim as if the motion would summon the courage he needed. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what I said to you." He raised his eyes to meet hers, the weight of his regret evident. "I was wrong, Mom. I let my pride, my success, everything blind me to what really matters." Aurelia's expression softened, but she didn't respond immediately. She studied her son, searching for sincerity in his words. "Andrew," she said finally, "I always knew you had a fire in you, that you were destined for something great. But somewhere along the way, you forgot who you are and who we were." Her words stung because they were true. Andrew nodded slowly. "I thought that if I could rise above our circumstances, I'd never have to face the pain of our past again. I didn't realize that I was running away from the very person who made that possible. You..." Aurelia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she maintained her composure. "I don't need your apology, Andrew. I need to know if you're ready to face the truth." Her words took him off guard. "The truth?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Aurelia took a deep breath, her hands resting on the table. "There are things I never told you, Andrew. I didn't want to burden you when you were young, and later it didn't seem like you wanted to hear them." Andrew leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What haven't you told me?" Aurelia's voice trembled as she began. "Your father. He didn't abandon us the way I always said he did. He left because I asked him to." Andrew's mind reeled. For years, he had carried a deep-seated anger toward the man he had never known, blaming him for the struggles they endured. "You asked him to leave?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. Aurelia nodded. "He wasn't a bad man, Andrew, but he wasn't a good one either. He had problems, gambling, debts, people he owed money to. Staying with him would have put us in danger. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I told him to go. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. The revelation hit Andrew like a tidal wave, washing over years of misconceptions and resentment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because I didn't want you to grow up with the weight of that truth," Aurelia said. "I wanted you to focus on your future, not on the mistakes of the past." Andrew leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. The narrative he had clung to his entire life, his father's abandonment, his mother's sacrifices, was more complex than he had ever imagined. Aurelia reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "I never told you because I was trying to protect you, but maybe I should have trusted you to handle the truth." Andrew met her gaze, the weight of her words settling in. "I've spent so long blaming others for my pain, trying to outrun it. But the truth is, I was afraid to face it, afraid to face myself." Aurelia squeezed his hand gently. "It's not too late, Andrew. We can't change the past, but we can decide what to do with it." For the first time in years, Andrew felt a sense of clarity. The walls he had built around himself began to crumble, replaced by a fragile but genuine connection with the woman who had been his foundation all along. As they left the cafe that evening, Andrew knew that his journey was far from over. But for the first time, he wasn't running. He was ready to face the truth and to rebuild the bond with his mother, piece by piece. What neither of them realized was that another twist awaited them, one that would test their newfound reconciliation and redefine the meaning of family. The days following Andrew and Aurelia's heart-to-heart conversation were filled with a strange sense of peace, but also uncertainty. For the first time in years, Andrew felt like he was living in the present, unburdened by the mistakes of the past. He and his mother began to reconnect, slowly rebuilding the fragile bond they had once shared. But the road to redemption was never easy. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of Aurelia's small apartment, Andrew looked at her with a determined expression. "I want to help you. I want to make up for everything I've done, and everything I've taken for granted." Aurelia, always humble and modest, shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything, Andrew. You've already given me the greatest gift, the chance to have you back in my life." But Andrew wasn't satisfied with just words. He had been thinking about the community center where his mother volunteered, the place where she had found purpose and belonging after he had cast her aside. He knew that this small organization, which had done so much for the people of Boston, needed more than just Aurelia's presence. It needed resources. It needed the kind of support he could provide. "I'm going to donate," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to make sure this place has everything it needs to thrive. I'll make a difference. Not just for you, but for everyone who relies on it." Aurelia looked at him, her eyes searching for signs of sincerity. "Andrew, you don't have to do that. I don't want you to feel obligated." "It's not obligation, Mom," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's about doing the right thing. For once in my life, I'm doing something because I believe it's the right thing to do." With those words, Andrew began the process of making a significant donation to the center. But as the days passed, the implications of his decision became clearer. His actions, once motivated by guilt and a desire for redemption, were now under scrutiny. The public, a public that had once admired him for his success, began to ask questions. What was his true motive? Why the sudden interest in charity? Soon, the media caught wind of Andrew's involvement, and the story broke. Andrew White, Millionaire CEO, donates millions to community center. But why now? The scrutiny was intense, and soon, doubts started to cloud Andrew's mind. Had he done the right thing? Or had he simply used the center as a way to repair his public image? Was this another attempt to prove himself, to get validation from the people who once looked down on him? One evening, As Andrew sat in his penthouse office, staring at the headlines that now covered his every move, he received a call. It was Aurelia. "Andrew," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what's happening. The center. They're saying that your donation is causing more harm than good." Andrew was stunned. "What do you mean?" "They're saying that the money is changing the nature of the center, that it's no longer a place of community, but a business. They think you're trying to take over, that you're using us to make yourself look good." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the redemption he had imagined. This was a nightmare he hadn't anticipated. As he hung up the phone, Andrew was left alone with his thoughts, his mind spinning. He had tried to make things right, but in his desperation to fix everything, had he done more harm than good? In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. Andrew faced backlash from both the public and the people closest to him. Some said he was exploiting the situation for his own gain, while others accused him of attempting to erase the hard-earned authenticity of the center. It was then that Andrew had a revelation. He realized that redemption wasn't something that could be bought or earned through grand gestures. It was a slow, painful process, a series of small, meaningful acts that built trust and repaired broken relationships over time. In the end, Andrew made the difficult decision to withdraw his donation. Instead, he chose to volunteer at the center, working side by side with the people Aurelia had grown so close to. He realized that the real work wasn't in writing a check. It was in the daily effort to show up, to listen, and to give without expectation of anything in return. As he worked alongside the community, Andrew began to feel a sense of peace that he had never known. It was in the quiet moments, when he spoke to the people whose lives had been touched by the center, that he understood the true meaning of redemption. In the end, Andrew didn't find what he was looking for in the headlines or in his wealth. He found it in the simple act of giving, not as a way to fix his past, but as a way to truly connect with the people who needed it most. And so, with his mother by his side, Andrew learned that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that required humility, patience, and a willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful.